strategy and why what that is. So basically the format is that each of them will speak for about 5 to 10 minutes about really their key take-home message from the COP and what they think was really interesting. And then we'll open it up to discussion. And then at with about 5 minutes left in the session, I'm actually going to turn over to my friend Frye, who's going to announce the location of the next conference. So we have a really fantastic panel. They have a great deal of experience between them. I'll just go in the order that they're sitting. So first of all, Peter Christoph is a political scientist and associate professor in the Department of Geography at the University of Melbourne, where he teaches climate policy and environmental policy. He's also formerly a member of the Victorian Premier's Climate Change Reference Group and of the Victorian Ministerial Reference Council on Climate Change Adaptation under the Victorian Brumby government. He's also currently a board member of the Australian Conservation Foundation and was its vice president for 8 years. His recent publications include the books 4 Degrees of Global Warming, Australia in a Hot World, and also Globalization and the Environment, which conveniently enough was co-authored with our next speaker, Robert Eckersley, who's a professor and head of political science in the School of Social Science and Political Sciences at the University of Melbourne. She was educated at the University of Western Australia, Cambridge University, and the University of Tasmania. And she's taught environmental politics and political theory at Monash from 1992 until 2001, before joining the University of Melbourne in 2002. She's published widely in the intersecting fields of environmental political theory, environmental politics and policy, and global environmental politics. Her current research focuses on the international climate change negotiations, particularly the role of the USA, the justice implications of carbon trading schemes, and the relationship between international trade and climate change. And she's a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences of Australia. Ian Frye is an international environmental law and policy expert. His focus is primarily on the mitigation policies associated with the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and its related agreements. He's the ambassador for climate change and environment for the government of Tuvalu and has worked for that government for the last 16 years. He is the Pacific Regional Representative to the United Nations for the International Council on Environmental Law, a member of the IUCN Commission on Environmental Law, and a research associate at the Centre for Climate Policy and Law at the Australian National University, and also a member of the Australian Association for Pacific Studies and the International Association for Small Island Studies. He's also a part-time lecturer here at the Fenner School for Environment and Society. Frank Gazzo is an associate professor and deputy director of the Crawford School, also here at the ANU, and director of the Center for Climate Economics and Policy. He's also an ANU Public Policy Fellow, and his focus is on policy-relevant research on the economics and policy of climate change, energy, and broader issues of environment development and economic reform. He's a frequent contributor to Australian and international policy debates, was advisor to Australia's Garno Climate Change Review, advisor to Indonesia's Ministry of Finance and the World Bank, and the lead author of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Fifth Assessment Report. He currently leads a collaborative research program on market mechanisms for China's climate and energy policy, and he teaches here at the ANU on domestic climate change policy and economics, and co-convenes the Master of Climate Change degree. Finally, Harold van Asselt is a senior research fellow at the Stockholm Environment Institute based in Oxford, and he co-leads the SEI initiative on fossil fuels and climate change. He has over 10 years research experience focusing on various aspects of international climate change law and policy, including the use of market-based mechanisms, climate trade policy interactions, reduced emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, or REDD, European climate policy and clean technology agreements. And before joining SEI, he was a Marie Curie Fellow at the Environmental Change Institute at the University of Oxford, and a researcher at the Institute for Environmental Studies at the VU University of Amsterdam. He's also editor of the Journal of the Review of European Comparative and International Environmental Law, and associate editor of Carbon and Climate Law Review. And he's recently informed me that from January onwards, he will be Professor of Climate Law and Policy at the University of Eastern Finland, although he will remain based in Oxford, which is quite a feat. So really, great thanks to all of you for being here, such a wealth of expertise, and I'll turn it over to Peter now to give his first brief comments. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that. Look, forgive me if I refer to this piece of paper in front of me occasionally. It has two things written on it. The first is stay awake, and the second is finish your sentences. I'm sure that everyone saw at least photographs, if not film footage, at the end of the Paris conference. It really was pretty much like Woodstock for climate negotiators and their devotees. There was love in the air. We almost expected people to break into song singing something like, this is the age of renewables, the birth of the age of renewables. It was a really very fine and very moving moment. I think it reflected two senses which were running simultaneously through that part of the conference. Firstly, I think there was a high degree of euphoria at the absence of failure as much as at the success of process in actually landing the conference. Given the experience, the extraordinarily traumatic experience for many people of the Copenhagen negotiations and the collapse that occurred after that, this was really seen as the last possible attempt of reflating effectively the multilateral processes around climate change. And it was successful in that I think it showed very careful, systematic learnings from the failures of Copenhagen in putting in place a set of mechanisms for transparent negotiation, for communication, for the construction process, which actually rebuilt trust and legitimacy in the UNFCCC and its processes. So at the end of that process, with I think some very painstaking work from Durban onwards, at least 4 years before the Paris negotiations, people were delighted to see that all of that hard work, and particularly the hard work of the French in the final year, had come to land and had come to land fairly successfully. Obviously included in that process were some other elements, such as, for example, the bilateral negotiations between the US and China, which in the previous year had landed a couple of very important agreements, and also the delivery of the INDCs, the nationally determined contributions, the targets that states had voluntarily put on the deck, of which I think there were 188 states delivering those INDCs by the end of the negotiations themselves. So in fact, through that inclusive, transparent, trust-building process, there had been a safety net constructed for Paris, which ensured that it would meet some degree of success. The question was how high would the level of ambition be at the end of that. I think at the end, for me at least, I saw a process which led to a recentered, robust multilateralism, a sort of robust multilateralism, a climate regime complex which had been strengthened at its core, that was precisely the thing that had been undermined by Copenhagen, and a recognition that a whole range of other processes like the bilaterals with the US and China, the G7, and a lot of involvement by non-state actors had reconfigured the system which is dealing with climate change. I think it's very important also not to confuse the success of process with the success of the agreement, and it is too early, I think, to say whether the agreement is a success or not. Like Joe and I's comment about the French Revolution, it's far too early to tell. So I just want to make a couple of comments about the actual substantive agreement itself, at least as I see them, in the areas in which I think one can begin to get a sense of whether it is actually going to deliver or not. Firstly, just in terms of the agreement itself, in 2020, it will, when it comes into force, one assumes it will come into force then, it will succeed and supplant much of the Kyoto Protocol, as some of the mechanisms of the Kyoto Protocol will be transferred into it. It is, I think, a nuanced displacement of the rhetoric about top-down, simple, binary approaches, and I take into account the comments that Frank Beeman made in the earlier session today about the rhetoric there, as opposed to the reality, with something that is much more explicitly complex in terms of how it delivers on differentiation and how it actually recognises multiple modes of power in negotiations, particularly around climate change. At the end of the day, I think the agreement is itself ambitious, but it's an ambitious promissory note with a very strong aspirational narrative, and I really want to emphasise that last point. A couple of issues that I just want to focus on. Firstly, the aims and the goals of the agreement, where I think it actually is exemplary and also extraordinary in terms of what it delivered. And I think it delivered far more than most negotiators expected that it would. As we know, the key element in Article 2 is that the aim of the agreement is to hold the increase in global average temperature to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 above pre-industrial levels, recognising that this would significantly reduce the risks and impacts of climate change. The inclusion of 1.5, which had been mentioned almost tangentially in the Copenhagen Accord, is given much more powerful prominence in the aims and goals of this agreement. That didn't happen accidentally. In fact, 1.5 was at times vigorously contested. I'm sure that Ian will add more, or can add much more to this discussion. It was contested by countries both within the developing country bloc, broadly described, and also countries in the developed country bloc. There's a contest over what that target would actually mean to development, particularly if 1.5 was landed without additional resources being provided to developing countries. There's some puzzles as to why some of the developed countries actually came in so hard behind it. It's very important to note that small island states led very prominently, both at Copenhagen and even more solidly in Paris, to enforce the adoption of 1.5 in some form or other in this agreement. I don't think this agreement would have been landed without 1.5 being significantly included, because there was recognition amongst the 100 or 120 so climate vulnerable states that 2 degrees was no longer a viable target to follow, and therefore there's a much stronger, I think, scientific base to the Paris Agreement. There are many reasons why one could say that this outcome, or at least the language that I've just described, read out to you, is perhaps a set of weasel words. As one negotiator said to me, look, we've just gone from an unrealistic target to a much more unrealistic target. In fact, the adoption of 1.5 in its current form was simply a way of buying off the small island states and others as a way of including them, as a way of loosening or reducing their ambition in other areas of the agreement, and so on and so forth. It's also, I think, important to recognise, as I'm sure most of you do, that the INDCs, the nationally determined contributions and targets that have been delivered prior to and during the Paris Agreement, the Paris Conference, certainly wouldn't land us with the sort of outcome that the agreement itself requires. So we've got an ambition at the moment which lands us about 2.7 to 3.5 degrees Celsius. There's a massive gap between where we're heading and what the agreement actually requires, actually recognised in the agreement itself. However, I think there are reasons not to be cynical, and I think that there's a great deal to be said for the ambition and aims and goals of the agreement itself. It provides us with a very strong mobilising narrative, one which actually will encourage civil society, governments and also business to focus on that ambition. I think the recognition of the gap between current orientation and where we need to land, described as clearly as it is in the agreement, I think is going to ramp up quite considerably real-world activity over the next several decades. So I think there's the urgency, the scientifically informed urgency embedded in this agreement is very important and is probably its most significant outcome. Let me refer to another part of the agreement, though, which I think gives us a sense of just how complex and also how compromised I think the agreement still is. And that's the Article 6, which refers to climate financing and bundles in with it a range of issues which are of particular concern for developing countries around the transfer of resources from the developed to the developing world, the issue of loss and damage, funding for loss and damage, about which I know Ian's going to say much more, the issue of compensation, and also the role of markets. If one looks at Article 6, I think the outcome there is very much less satisfying and much less settled than one would want. As I think many of you recognise, in Copenhagen, the agreement, the Copenhagen Accord really only landed when the developed countries led by the United States finally agreed to provide something like $100 billion by 2020. This issue came up again, and there's a significant gap between commitment of finance at this point in time and that 2020 target, and there's a real anxiety about the process of delivering further financial commitments to achieve that funding transfer. The Paris Agreement doesn't provide sufficient and strong enough mechanisms to ensure that that gap will be met by 2020, nor does it actually allow countries to re-engage with that issue before 2025, when the issue of further funding is revisited, using $100 billion as a floor for further contributions into the future. The issue of loss and damage, which is a very important one and critical one for developing states, particularly the least developed and most vulnerable states, really was, I think, kicked down the road. It's a very complex issue, and one which, in particular, a number of developed countries, and specifically the United States and Australia, see as part of a narrative which leads to another concern, which is compensation for the impacts of climate change engendered by and delivered by the efforts of developed countries historically, and up to this point in time. Compensation is seen as a red line issue, and the United States and Australia, amongst others, simply don't want to engage with that at all. So that very large and very important bundle of discussion is really, loss and damage is included in the agreement, but it's not done so substantively, and further discussion is going to have to occur over the next couple of COPs at least to try and resolve that. There's a great deal of faith based in the agreement in the potential of carbon markets, in particular the trading of carbon credits internationally to deliver mitigation. My belief is that that faith is both misplaced and greatly inflated in the agreement itself. The reliance upon those sorts of mechanisms, I think, is a central component of the agreement, and again, I think there are significant problems there. One of the biggest problems, I think, that is delivered in the discussion around climate finance is the issue of equity and differentiation between developing and developing countries. And here, in this very important part of the agreement, I think that the issues of equity and the transfer of resources is very much underplayed, and therefore is a significant problem which will be revisited over time. So the problem of differentiation between developed and developing countries, I think, has been played down. It's been to some significant extent, I think, watered down. Responsibility has been diffused, in a sense recognising the inability of the group of countries, the 195 countries who are part of the convention, to actually land an agreement which would require delivery of targets and certain mechanisms. But for all of that, I think that the actual outcome, the implementation of the Paris Agreement, is still going to be a fairly fraught and difficult space to watch. So high ambition on the one hand, and a very powerful rhetoric, very powerful and appropriate rhetoric there, but some real complexities and real problems with delivery mechanisms. One last comment, and this is perhaps a reflection on how the agreement is already beginning to work. It's been interesting to see how Australia performed both during the negotiations and also in the time since we've come back just to follow the media in Australia over the last 24 hours or so. Australia at Paris was, I think, caught flat-footed by the pace and the change in ambition in the negotiations. It tried to hunt with the hounds and run with the hares, but it was very quickly, I think, caught out, both in terms of the blandness of the statements made by Malcolm Turnbull at the start and the very, I think, limited offerings that he made then, and also subsequent comments both by Environment Minister Hunt and then Foreign Minister Bishop. The impact of the negotiations and the outcome of the negotiations, I think, are already being felt in countries like Australia where ambition has been relatively low. And I think that what we can see is the rhetoric and the narrative of the agreement beginning to force the pace in Australia, and hopefully that will also be the case elsewhere. So, I'm I think, an optimistic cynic at this point in time. I think the agreement is, on the whole, a very powerful tool, but we're going to have to work with it very, very effectively to actually make it do what we're hoping it's going to do. Thanks very much.
Well, during the course of this long 2 weeks in Paris, I had a number of drunken arguments with critics of multilateralism who said that sometimes nothing was better than something. But I say to all the naysayers, and I won't say any names, that I think this outcome is a vindication of the slow boat multilateral process. I think before the Paris conference even opened, there were many reasons why we knew it was going to be relatively more successful than Copenhagen in diplomatic terms. Obviously, the G2's cooperation was really important. That was absent at Copenhagen, but don't be mistaken, this cooperation was to create a landing zone that they were comfortable with, and that's where it did land in the end. And it's very important because the G2 played a big role in the preparation for Paris, but once the negotiations began, China went quite quiet and retreated inside the like-minded developing group of countries and allowed some of the other countries in that group to do its bargaining for it. The US played a mixed role in many ways, and I'll come to that in a moment. But the fact that you had all these INDCs up front meant you had a kind of ready-made achievement, albeit one that was underwhelming in ambition terms. Also, the 3 out of the 4 basic countries, that is South Africa, Brazil and China, actually had INDCs that involved an eventual aggregate reduction in emissions, not just a reduction from growth. This is pretty historic. We've never seen that before at any COP. The cost curve for renewables, of course, has plummeted, and that's helped to ease the pain for a lot of countries. And then never underestimate French diplomatic pride. And clearly, Laurent Fabius, who was the COP president, who got a thunderous standing ovation at the end. And when he was delivering one of his final speeches, and I was struggling to follow the French and switch to English, the English translator started to break down. crying because you could just hear her voice. She was not able to hold it together because it was such a moving moment. So there was certainly a lot of tears and a lot of euphoria on that last day. So I just want to talk about who should we celebrate, what are the disappointments, who are the spoilers, and what are the curiosities that emerged from this and the disappointment, and how are we to think about this INDC process going forward. One of the biggest disappointments is the disconnect between the really fantastic temperature target, which includes 1.5, and the actual mechanism to follow up and deliver, which is a bottom-up process. There was originally a call for ex-ante review and an equity reference framework, strongly pushed by South Africa on behalf of a lot of developing countries, and that got thrown out the window. The US carefully was very insistent that there be words that no mention of liability or compensation should appear in the loss and damage wording, and there's a provision in the COP decision. A lot of the really important things are in COP decisions, and the agreement itself was whittled down to a much shorter document than what we originally had. Peter's mentioned the failure of Malcolm Turnbull. I was thinking that his speech on that opening day was his big opportunity to finally announce some improvements in the coalition policy, but all we saw was a bit more climate finance, $200 million over 5 years, which was no advance on previous commitments, and it was robbing the aid budget. Everything else he said was pure fluff. In addition to that, the climate finance was held off to 2025 and permissive rather than, there were no shells in that language. China was interesting, as I said, because it became quiet once the conflict started. Oh, sorry. I don't know what that's on. Is that better? Yeah, it is better. The G2 played a really important opening and closing role. They helped to prepare some momentum beforehand. And on the final day, most of the work was happening through frantic phone calls off-site, not at Le Bourget, but US ringing China, US ringing Cuba, to tell the Nicaraguan environment minister not to have a big venting speech prior to the gavel going down, but to have it afterwards, which was really weird, but nonetheless, that's what happened. The US made sure that the language of INDCs did not include the word achieve or implement. It was merely to prepare and communicate and maintain INDCs and to pursue them at the national level. And of course, without that, neither China or the US, actually, or India for that matter, would have actually signed up. So the idea was that this core of this whole agreement, the INDCs, were not to be expressed as an internationally legally binding commitment. So the US Senate was still wagging the multilateral dog in this respect. The spoilers, of course, it was Saudi Arabia, using its power to block at every move, supported by a few other petro-states. The curiosities, the provisions, there's this, if you were to read Article 6, because that's not the one on finance, it's another article, it's on cooperative mechanisms, and you will not find any reference to carbon markets in this agreement. What you have is a reference to cooperative mechanisms by which you can cooperate with another country to increase your mitigation ambition. So it's all in euphemisms, and that's because a bunch of South American countries had a seriously strong objection to carbon markets, and that was a red line for them. But clearly there's going to be carbon markets. The old flexibility mechanisms of Kyoto will be transformed into something new, hopefully something more robust. So that's a really interesting feature. Something that was central to the Kyoto period was something that was dealt in euphemistic language in the Paris Agreement. Heroes? Well, Obama, yes and no. Certainly, this is a legacy issue for him. It was absolutely important. He instigated the G2 cooperation, the joint statement in November in 2014, and did a huge amount of work. And there was 12 months preparation, 12 months of work that went into that. But they also, his team was also part of getting words like compensation and liability out of the agreement. The Vulnerable Forum, which was a group of vulnerable countries, showed a lot of solidarity there, but President de Blum, the Marshall Islands, played a very important role leading from behind and stitching up this coalition of the high ambition, which included the EU, the US, Mexico, Brazil, Canada joined. And curiously, on the Friday, the final Friday of the 2 weeks Julie Bishop said Australia would like to join, or would be joining, and De Bruyn said, or was reported to have said, we are very, we welcome Australia's interest. We'd also like to see what sort of credentials you could bring to this college. It's quite interesting. Now, the curiosities, finally, I want to finish by talking about the quality of the INDCs. I read many of them, not all of them. But the legal call for climate action a year ago called for parties to justify the fairness and ambition of their INDCs, and the job that most countries did was woeful. The INDCs varied hugely from very, very long, elaborate narratives from India, which on the opening page began with the virtues of yoga, and quotes from the Mahatma Gandhi, and then it went into a fire and brimstone argument about climate justice and, you know, the very small per capita carbon footprint of Indians, and finally a long description of Indian climate policies. China again talked about it. The first many pages were in Mandarin, the English bit at the back. It talked about its role as a responsible power, its pursuit of an ecological civilization, but both in the Indian and the Chinese INDCs were some implicit red lines being drawn as well. The US was really short. It declared its INDC to be short and to be fair and ambitious by definition. The EU's was very perfunctory. Bhutan, the tiny state of Bhutan with the gross national happiness indicator, said it would protect 60% of its forests. There were a welter of weird and wonderful documents to read, but only Switzerland, amongst the developed countries, really took this requirement to justify the fairness and ambition of the INDC seriously. So they were basically a dog's breakfast. A lot of countries were hiding behind self-serving metrics, providing woefully inadequate justifications. So I think what we see after Paris now is a new experiment in multilateralism that's producing what I call a global show and tell regime. Okay? And because the most important, crucial part of this agreement, the INDCs, are expressed in soft legal form, then they depend on the critical glare of publicity to make sure that in the showing there is adequate, reliable information, and in the telling there is a full justification. And I think the job rests with civil society, think tanks, researchers, and so forth, to really make sure that countries do a good job there and to hold them to their word. With the legal form as well, a lot of people say, well, what happens if Rubio wins the Conservative, it becomes the candidate for president? He said, he described the Paris Agreement as an unfunny joke. Said that yesterday. The big debate, I think, went on today. I'm interested to see what it is. Well, we know that this is not going to be presented to the Senate for its advice and consent. And the reason is that the US executive often signs an international treaty and doesn't do that. That's if the substance of the treaty is already US law of the land. And Obama has used his executive powers under the Clean Air Act to implement the Clean Power Plan and many other measures, and therefore he doesn't need the consent and advice of the US Senate, or so the Democrat lawyers say. So we'll finish with that.
So what I thought I would do is, I was involved in the negotiations. My role was representing the Tuvalu government, and Tuvalu being the least developed country, I was given the dubious responsibility of coordinating the least developed countries on the new agreement, which was a challenge in itself. So I thought I'd give a few insights into some of these issues that we've heard. And by the second week of the COP, the French were presented with a text that came out of their ad hoc Durban platform process with the two co-chairs, and they had to then assess where the real crunch issues lay. And I guess there were from their assessment and our assessment, there were four key crunch issues. The one on ambition, as we've heard, setting a goal, a long-term goal for the agreement. The second one was differentiation, how to treat the respective roles of the developed and developing countries, the issue of finance, and the loss and damage, which was seen as a sort of one of these sort of issues that were hanging in the air. So on the ambition issue, this had been part of a long discussion. I was involved in various meetings. I think I was travelling every month this year to various preparatory meetings for the COP. And it was clear that we still had a major divide between whether we'd land with a below 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius. The European Union was stuck in the 2 degrees world since Copenhagen. And we had bilateral meetings with the EU, and they explained to us privately that they had problems with some of their member countries, that they couldn't release the 2 degrees and consider that further. Obviously, some of the Eastern European countries were a problem for them. Just before the COP, President Obama had a meeting with some Pacific and Caribbean countries and tried to convince them to a 2 degrees goal. And in fact, I attended a bilateral meeting with the UN Secretary General in September of this year in New York as part of the sort of side part of the UN General Assembly between my Prime Minister, Enele Sopoanga, and Ban Ki-moon, and he tried to convince us on a 2 degrees goal. So there was some quite high level pressure coming on to land on 2 degrees. But and I also attended a meeting just before the COP between the French government, President Hollande, and Pacific Island countries as part of this ongoing dialogue called the French Oceania dialogue, which we had at his residence. And again, there was this discussion about 2 degrees and 1.5. But I think the French negotiators themselves saw that there was a strong momentum for 1.5, and they realised that they had to find some landing ground on this. The Ambition Coalition, as we heard, had already had 3 meetings. I attended one of those in in Paris. My minister attended one earlier in Paris. So it met for the 3rd time in Paris just before the COP started. And it was a sort of coalition of sort of like-minded countries. So initially it was the European Union, Marshall Islands, Norway, Angola, represent least developed countries, Gambia and Colombia and Tuvalu, as a sort of group of countries who were seen as to be the sort of pushing towards the high ambition. The meeting we had in Paris the United States was invited along as well. So the sort of high ambition was starting to sort of erode a little, I guess, while engaged in the United States. And so that started to become a sort of a show more than a sort of dialogue. And in fact, they started producing press conferences and joint statements. And at that stage, we withdrew from the coalition of high ambition because we thought it was no longer a dialogue but more a show and trying to bring in other countries. Just around the 1.5, 2 degrees, it became clear that we had to sort of find the bridging language to accept that below 2 degrees was the starting point, but moving in a direction towards 1.5. And I think the landing zone for that was quite successful, I think, to bridge the 2, because it does set a goal that 1.5 is still around. The other thing we had to deal with is that within that sort of long-term goal was to come up with a phraseology to do with long-term goal. And we played around with words like decarbonisation, climate neutrality, net zero emissions. And for each one of those sort of phrases or terms, there were problems. Decarbonisation was certainly not going to fly with some countries. Certainly the OPEC countries had made early statements about that. Net zero emissions implies that you have significant offsetting from the land sector because of the use of the word net. And so there were countries who were quite concerned about that. In fact, a lot of the least developed countries were quite concerned that their food security would be affected by having this sort of word net, because they figured that some of their land would be taken over by biofuels and things like that to meet that. So there was a concern about all the terms that we were playing: climate neutrality, There were people interpreting that as meaning nuclear power, carbon capture and storage, and various other terms that were inherent in that term. So that they were complicated. So I think the landing zone, the other issue is that we in our bilaterals on loss and damage, particularly the United States, they saw the 1.5 as a trade for loss and damage. So that was interesting sort of how they interpreted it. They said if you want to get 1.5, you've got to give up on loss and damage. So that was one issue. And to his credit, the Prime Minister Tuvalu put his foot down and said, no, these are not items that are traded between the two. They're two distinct issues. So that was the ambition one. So in essence, it sort of came out with a sort of landing zone, which I think is quite useful. It sort of directs us towards a sort of longer term goal, but obviously we would have preferred, the small island states would prefer to just direct reference to below 1.5 without any reference to 2 degrees. The differentiation issue obviously was a very complex issue of how to find the position. The United States had this sort of universality view of the world that the rules applied to everybody. Of course, this was a face-off primarily between the US and China, but there was a lot of collateral damage in that sort of face-off, because there are certainly lower-income developing countries who could not, be expected to take on the same sorts of commitments, standards of reporting and accountability that some of the more advanced developing countries and developed countries would need to take on board. So we played around with some words like developed countries and those in a position to do so as a sort of bridging language to try and find that the major developing countries could take on voluntarily an obligation to take on similar commitments to developed countries. There was problems with that wording because in a position to do so implies somebody determining whether they were in a position to do so or not. And that made some countries very nervous about that. Certainly Brazil and China were very nervous about this in a position to do so. So we started playing around with words like willing to do so, to sort of try and see whether there was a sort of voluntary nature that some countries would step up and take similar obligations. Within that discussion of differentiation, there was a lot of rhetoric, and we heard a lot of rhetoric coming out of Malaysia about poverty, equity issues and things like that. You could have lots of debate about whether that's a valid argument or not. I think from our perspective, it was not a valid argument to suggest that a middle-income developing country like Malaysia could play the poor card successfully. But that was seriously played out. That was the sort of groupings of what was called the like-minded developing countries were playing that out quite hard. In the end, the other sort of side game to this sort of differentiation issue was the least developed countries were putting in a marker wherever we could to say our situation is quite different. The least developed countries, because of their economic disadvantage, had to be counted as another level of obligation. And that is reflected in the text as it stands. The other issue of differentiation that played out was the vulnerability issue, particularly in the adaptation text, was who was the most vulnerable. And this was a very intense negotiation, and was on the second last day of the COP, there were meetings of the developing countries, the G77, having very intense discussions about who were the most vulnerable. And certainly, least developed countries and small island developing states were positioning themselves out of language that came out of the Bali COP, which said least developed countries, small island states and countries in Africa suffering from droughts and floods was the category of most vulnerable. But the Latin American countries had realised that they'd missed out on that in that positioning. And so they wanted to be added to the list. And so that then, once Latin American countries added to the list, then you had other countries like small mountainous countries, and so it became a shopping list of who was the most vulnerable. And that became a real challenge to how to define that. In the end, it basically ended up the French making the decision. Basically, they basically landed with a reference to LDCs and Cs, and Africa lost out on that. And they were quite upset about that. On the last night of the COP, they were almost going to not support the outcome document because Africa dropped off the list. So that was that issue. The finance issue, was clearly a game of how would you, ensure that this 100 billion, which was established in Copenhagen, would be a floor from 2020 onwards. In the earlier versions of the agreement, they actually had the figure 100 billion in it, which to me was very extraordinary. It's unusual to have a legally binding agreement with a numerical number in it, and people realised that in the end and put that into the decision text. I think what we were trying to see was a regular mechanism of ratcheting up the finance. So you set a floor based on the Copenhagen funding, noting, however, that the wording of Copenhagen says primarily for mitigation outcomes. So that sets uncertainty as to how much funding would go for adaptation work. So in the end, the sort of the 100 billion base was put into a COP decision, but we established a mechanism, a review mechanism of financial contribution. So that was useful. The issue of loss and damage, which I was very closely involved in the negotiations. At the previous session in Geneva, the G77 managed to have a common position on loss and damage, and it was an elaborate position of establishing a new mechanism on loss and damage to bring forward new work. We had a proposal for a climate change displacement mechanism for people displaced by the impacts of climate change, and a procedure for looking at permanent and irreversible losses. And the whole issue of permanent and irreversible loss was poison to the United States, because their lawyers were telling them that this would open up the door for liability and compensation provisions. And we had bilateral meetings in New York in September, again with the US negotiators on this issue, and that was where they had major concerns. So we never really had any formal negotiations until the second last night on loss and damage. It was such a sensitive issue that they figured, the French and the co-chairs beforehand figured that this was an issue that had to be resolved bilaterally, but primarily between the least developed countries and the United States to find a landing zone for that. And we only had one session where we had all parties around the table discussing this issue. And in that round table, 4 positions were presented on how to move forward with that issue. In fact, I think it was on the midweek of last week, I'm still trying to work out through times, we had a bilateral with John Kerry. That was the Prime Minister of Tuvalu and myself, and John Kerry had a bilateral to work out how we could find a landing zone for loss and damage, and particularly this reference to liability and compensation. And we didn't resolve that. We impressed upon John Kerry this is a critical issue in the agreement. And we also met with the French bilaterally. I was asked to meet with the French ambassador to see how that sort of negotiation process was being carried out. The French, to their credit, gave the assurance that loss and damage would be in the agreement. The US tried to bury it in 3 different ways. First they wanted it in the part of the agreement that dealt with adaptation, to add what they called ambiguity as to whether this was an adaptation issue or it was a sort of a loss and damage issue. The second way they did it was to continue the sort of Warsaw mechanism, which had been agreed under a COP decision, so that it would be just a continuation of a COP process and would be in the agreement text. So it was just more of the same. And the third one was that they wanted explicit language which removed any consideration of liability and compensation. So eventually, on the second last night, we had a bilateral meeting in a small room up in the presidency with the US lawyers. It included a couple of people from the least developed countries and small island states, and we hammered out the wording that you see now. That the night before, John Kerry also had another meeting with the Prime Minister of Tuvalu, in which I wasn't allowed to attend, so it was just a one-on-one. They agreed that this liability clause would be in a COP decision, which significantly diminishes its legal context. So that was a major outcome, I think, in that regard. I think it was unrealistic to believe that loss and damage would open the door for compensation and liability considerations. That would never come out of a multilateral process like that. So in the end, we had the text that came out. Interestingly enough, at the last minute of the COP, before the gavel was about to fall, Nicaragua decided it was unhappy with the liability clause, and so they objected to it, and it looked like they were going to block the final COP. So and they used the Chinese minister as their go-between. So we had to run to the front of the main COP plenary, meet with the Chinese minister, with an interpreter, and discuss with him, and then go and see the Nicaraguan minister. Meanwhile, there were phone calls to the president of Nicaragua, and I had to chase the minister. He was then called to the Secretary General's office, and I walked with him and tried to convince him that a declaratory statement might be a way of resolving this issue. And while he was still meeting with the Secretary General, I think they gavelled the COP. So it was a very clever tactic used by the French to distract him out of the process. So this is how the game plays out in these sorts of the processes. We've never really had a formal discussion on loss and damage, yet we've got an outcome. I think it's quite useful. It's a progress to bring it into the agreement, considering that at one stage the US had, at the last session in Geneva, didn't want any reference to loss and damage at all. So, I think this, more than just being a process for bringing in liability, will deliver key outcomes for countries, particularly on risk transfer schemes, to really push that forward. In Tuvalu's case, we had a major cyclone earlier this year, which caused an enormous amount of damage, and the sort of aid that we received was very ad hoc and has sort of evaporated when other emergencies come in. So having these formal risk transfer measures will certainly deliver a lot more. So overall, I guess we've got everybody on board to this agreement. As Robin indicated, there's no formal commitment to implement NDCs determined. So that was to accommodate the US. The ambition to at least bring on board below 1.5 is useful, but I think the crucial part of the agreement is to have these 5-year review cycles, because that will ratchet up effort, I think, and that, if nothing else, that's the crucial aspect of the agreement. And to get something on loss and damage, I think, is a useful way forward. Thanks very much.
I'll keep my comments real brief because I actually want to hear more from Ian in the Q&A. In my view, this was a tremendous success. Okay, Paris was a tremendous success, and it was set up for success because, as I view it, the major powers were pretty much in agreement going into Paris, and then nothing went wrong. Okay? And nothing went wrong probably deserves, a lot of credit to the French who handled this tremendously well. And if you want to see some more informed analysis and opinion of that, read Howard Bamsey's blog on the Australian Institute of International Affairs blog, where he spells out a bit more in terms of the French strategy there. But credit also needs to go to a lot of people who work very, very hard on this for a very long time. People like Ian who really dedicate a substantial amount of their time, their lives to this kind of outcome. So I just want to say a few things about a few specific issues. First of all, long-term goal, well below 2 degrees with a view to 1.5 degrees is a really significant achievement. In part because at the national level, where ultimately anything that actually happens at the national level, this can be a reality check for decades to come as to whether any change in policy, any approval for major projects, etc., actually stacks up in the light of that agreed ambition of keeping temperature rise to well below 2 degrees. Okay, so this should be important, and I think it will be important. It is a very lofty ambition. And so my personal guess would be that, again, for decades down the track, we will be comparing existing track record and existing pledges to that goal, and we will be saying, well, ambition needs to be lifted. Okay, so that's probably what we're set up to. In terms of, Ian mentioned this as well, the earlier words in earlier draft text, net zero emissions or decarbonisation. Personally, well, maybe it was never realistic to have these in the agreement. I think it would have been tremendously useful to have them in the agreement because they spell out more clearly what actually needs to happen if we are to keep global warming to less than 2 degrees. Decarbonisation will need to happen. In fact, there's a growing sense of inevitability of that. And to have had, if we had had those words in the agreement, that would have been useful for translating this international policy. National pledges. So we've got national pledges from over 180 countries, and I think that helps with action both in developing countries and developed countries. So you've got differentiation, of course, in terms of the expectation as to when countries or at what level of development countries are expected to put forward an absolute reduction target, but all countries are putting their national pledges, and that helps remove roadblocks to action in developed countries as well, because it's becoming harder and harder to claim that developing countries are not doing anything. Now, these nationally determined pledges do not have legally binding status. In my view, that is absolute necessity, otherwise you wouldn't have the United States on board, and otherwise you would see much weaker pledges for many countries because they wouldn't see as an out if things didn't turn out as well as expected. Ratcheting up emission every 5 years, I think there's really significant reason for optimism that can and will happen. Why? Well, first of all, technological progress on low carbon technologies tends to be much faster than anticipated. National experiences with implementing low carbon policies tend to be much better than feared or anticipated upfront, and so a kind of a pledge and review mechanism on all accounts should lead to positive outcomes in terms of ratcheting up. Another reason for optimism is the way I view this, the thinking about climate change mitigation has changed substantially over the last 5 years or so. From it being viewed as a burden and an economic cost that has to be attributed to countries according to some sort of key of burden sharing, to a discourse and a thinking about this now as an economic opportunity. Low carbon growth, okay, is becoming more than just a set of words and becoming something that gets a bit more entrenched in countries' thinking and economic strategies, and China, to me, really is the archetypal example of that. A low carbon development pathway is seen as exactly in line with ambitions to reduce local air pollution, with ambitions to improve energy security, with ambition for China to achieve a leadership role in the development and manufacturing of the technologies of the future. So that all pulls in one direction, and turns a low carbon strategy into something that countries don't need to be persuaded to take on, but that are actually happy to take on as long as it takes place in a way that benefits national economies. On consensus in UN climate agreements, there was a really interesting discussion in the semi-plenary this morning about different ways of differentiating countries in how much say they have. I thought Paris was actually an example of how that actually happens already in practice, right? And Nicaragua, for example, simply not being able to scuttle the thing at the last minute. Finance, how do we deal with this? Perhaps, it was always going to be one of the most difficult things to settle in the Paris Agreement, and I don't think it is settled. And ultimately, I think there needs to be a realization that governments can only go so far in terms of pledging finance and funding, and the bulk of it will need to be private financing anyway. And governments' roles will have to be to smooth the way for these much larger private funding flows. End of the day, all action is national, and I think the Paris Agreement paves the way for national policies to go in the right direction. In terms of Australia, I would say the sense that Paris was that Australia is back in the fold in a way, back as a nation that contributes constructively to the global effort, if not perhaps always being at the forefront of environmental action, but nevertheless a constructive role. And going forward, I think the onus will now be on government to actually provide the underpinning of that positive sentiment that has been created. Already, government here has hinted that there will be the target will be strengthened as part of the review. There will be a policy review of climate change policies in 2017. And ultimately, as I said right at the start, everything will need to be examined in light of that global ambition of well below 2 degrees.
Let me start with a bit of a meta-reflection on basically what we're here doing at this panel. Those of you who've had a chance to look at their emails and look at the news in the last past days are probably a little bit like me, overwhelmed by the sheer amount of analysis, observations and discussions of the Paris Agreement. And I think that in part, of course, can reflect the importance of Paris and maybe the historic nature of the agreement. But at the same time, it's maybe indicative of a wider trend that I've noticed, especially in the last few years, of a simple proliferation of information about climate policy. And on the one hand, that can be welcomed. It's great if we start to learn more and more about how to do this effectively. At the same time, of course, we can also start to get worried about the sheer overload of information and really trying to figure out what is actually the type of useful information that we deal with. So how can we still stand out and avoid just parroting each other? And I'm actually quite happy to see so far that the panel is making different points so far. We haven't coordinated this at all. But also we need to be careful not to come up with, let's say, very superficial, knee-jerk reactions to these agreements. Having said that, what I'm going to do now is give you superficial, knee-jerk reactions to these agreements. So I'm going to address some of the same topics that the rest of the panel have discussed as well, but also some other points. So one of the points that I want to raise is about differentiation. And I think already with Copenhagen, but now it's pretty much confirmed in Paris, we see actually more rather than less differentiation. And I think you can see this in the nationally determined contribution, which in a way are self-differentiated, and for each country they're quite different, as Robin was already mentioning. But you also see this increasingly in the transparency arrangements, where a lot of differentiation, I would expect, is going to play out in the next few years. LDCs and SIDS are, so the small island states are already mentioned explicitly, but I would imagine that other countries are also going to basically make the case that in the transparency arrangements there should be differentiation, or that specific circumstances should be taken into account. In a way, you can see this as good news in the sense that it acknowledges that to keep global warming below 2 degrees, let alone 1.5 degrees, we need action across the board, not just in the developed countries, but also in some of the advanced economies that he was referring to. At the same time, it's also bad news in the sense that some of the developed countries have been able to weaken their commitments, and this is of course the shall versus should discussion that took place at the very last minute. But of course, and this is also what Robin was already referring to, the trade-off here is like, well, do we want broad participation or not? And in a way, the trade-off has been that, well, we want broad participation, we want the US on board, but that has been at the cost of the shall. So, moving on to that issue of participation, I think most of us would probably be agreeing that in many respects the agreement is quite shallow. But I think the good news is that participation is very likely going to be broad. And I think one indication has been that euphoric atmosphere that was there in last Saturday, everyone hugging each other. And of course, the people sitting in the room are not necessarily the parliaments and other actors that need to ratify these agreements at home. But I think it's quite a strong indication that I think the ratification will be quite high. And then one issue related to that, which hasn't been discussed yet, is the entry into force requirements. And I think actually it's been quite surprising. At one point I think it was just the necessity to have only 55 parties. That would have been really easy because basically the LDCs and SIDS together could have basically made the agreement enter into force. But now it's 55 parties with 55% shareable greenhouse gas emissions. And again, I think that's a relatively straightforward and relatively manageable entry into force requirement for this agreement. Because I think, a quick calculation, I think it's the US, China and the EU together could almost pretty much make the agreement enter into force with the participation of a number of smaller countries. So one of the things that I conclude from that is that if this high ambition coalition will actually continue their activities and continue their coalition, and maybe Ian can talk more about that, and also actually ratify this quite fast, this agreement could enter into force very quickly. Another point that I wanted to raise is about ratcheting, which several of you have mentioned as well. And I think compared to what could have been the ratcheting mechanism is actually quite weak. Of course it's useful to have this facilitated dialogue in 2018, and of course it's in a way good that every 5 years, 29, okay, then from 2023 you have every 5 years you have this stock take, and in a way that can be seen as quite useful. But one of the things that is missing is that the link between this dialogue first, but also the stock take later, and actually the revision of INDCs. So how will the outcomes of these stock takes actually influence parties in the revisions? So that's a bit more the skeptical view of the ratcheting mechanism. At the same time, I think there actually has been a major achievement in the Paris Agreement, and that's the enshrinement of the notion of progression, that we're only going to move forward, we're not going to move back. And the achievement, I think, can be highlighted by actually seeing what was left out of the text. So if you look at one of the earlier drafts, is that several countries, I think Australia might have been one of them, have been pushing for exceptions to the progression principle by saying, well, in cases of force majeure or in cases of economic shocks, we might be able to go back. And I think it's quite an achievement that none of these provisions are in there, because I think it really would have opened a Pandora's box. Because what is an economic shock? Is that a financial crisis where all of a sudden the country is saying, okay, no, sorry, we can't do anymore because we need to impose some austerity measures? So I'm quite happy at least that this was included in the agreement. And then finally, I think, just from a very practical matter, just looking at the news after Paris, I think it's interesting to know what you already mentioned. Australia giving an indication that it might ratchet up its INDC before 2020. I think similar reports have come out of Canada and France. Unfortunately, though, there was also a report that the European Commissioner for Climate Action immediately said that the EU wouldn't do so. And this is very likely due to the opposition of Poland, but unfortunately the EU is not trying to take the lead there. So we'll in the end, we'll need to see whether this race to the top, what people are hoping for, really emerges, but I at least think that a race to the bottom has been prevented. Then finally, I think that one thing that Paris allows us is actually to shift our attention not to the UNFCCC level, but focusing on actually where the action really needs to take place. In national governments, in businesses, in other sectors, in what the civil society is doing. And I think this is really one of the major benefits of having this agreement in place. Is that yes, of course we need to talk about the rules that we're going to develop in the next few years, but we can primarily focus on implementation. And I think for a lot of stakeholders, for NGOs, this is going to be really important because it allows them to really focus on those actors, whether they be national governments, whether they be fossil fuel industries, and hold them to account. And then related to that, I think one of the things that we haven't mentioned in the panel yet, and I think is a positive outcome there as well, is that it's quite clear by now that it's not just about the national governments, but that it's about a lot of other actors who are implementing these actions. And again, it's an acknowledgement that it's not just about what we're doing at the international level or at the national level, but that in the end climate action is happening all over the place. And I think by now the non-state actor zone for climate action, so the NASCA platform, which was launched last year, lists for over 10,000 actions. Of course, commitments do not make action as such, but at least it provides a mechanism for stakeholders who want to hold these actors to account, to at least point out to them, well, you committed to this, you pledged this or that, why don't you do that? So in the end, I'm mildly positive also about the outcomes. I have some concerns about the registering mechanism, and then hopefully it will play out well, but I think there's a lot of work still also for Ian to do in the coming years. But of course you like that job anyway. So I'm mildly positive, but I think also for us it's a reason to continue to engage, not just at the international level, but also at the national level. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much, everyone. We don't have too much time. I'll take a couple of questions in a row. And you can just try to keep them brief.
Thanks. Before that, I was going to go into like a big lyrical thing. Now that the microphone, I may as well rap. I'm really interested, I think it's Article 4.4, which mentions the absolute emissions reduction targets, and it uses that term. And I'm really curious what people's thoughts are on whether that's going to have an impact on hot air. So for instance, all of the hot air that Australia has got through our various gamings of the Kyoto Protocol, meaning that our 26 to 28% reduction in our INDC is not actually necessarily going to amount to an actual reduction. It will still permit us to increase by around about 5%. And I feel like the language of that absolute emissions reduction target precludes hot air to a certain degree. And I was just curious what other people's thoughts are on that.
Got any questions on that side? One at the back. Okay, go ahead and answer that one. We'll move our way around. Does anyone want to feel that? Yeah.
It doesn't preclude hot air. Yeah, that's a simple answer. But I'll just use this opportunity to add to a point that Hara made about the rationing mechanism. Each party's successive contributions will not only be a progression forward from the last one, but also represent, and this is in the treaty, not the COP decision, shall represent each party's highest possible ambition. And also before the 2019 facilitated dialogue, or stock taking, in 2018, the IPCC is required to produce a report on emission pathways to 1.5 and also describe the impacts of warming above 1.5. So that happens a year before 2019 when the facilitated dialogue happens, and then in 2020, each of the parties have to indicate their post-2030 INDCs, or if it's the US post-2025. So all of these are more things that will drive emission. The downside is that there are some parties that will not have to change their 2030 target at all from what they put in this year. So we're all hoping there'd be a review of those and upward rationing of that, and then successive rationing after, but it's really only going to be an expectation for successive rationing after. That said, with our IPCC report in 2018, the facilitated dialogue in 2019, before the agreement supposedly comes into force in 2020, if we have the requisite ratifications, I think many parties will revise upward. How many remains to be seen.
Just quickly on that, absolute. I mean, we needed to make sure there was a guarantee that at least the developed countries did, had a standard to which they'd already committed to, at least in the Kyoto Protocol, so that they couldn't sort of take a lower requirement than what was in it. So that's inherent in those words. But inherent in those words are the opportunities for certainly hot air for certain countries to do things that they would have done anyway. And I think if you look at the NDC for Russian Federation, I think there are significant opportunities for hot air there.
1.5 degrees. So I'm hearing everyone interpreting it as ambition, but from what I understand, it's a really improbable outcome in reality. Could it also, or is this me being paranoid, be a Trojan horse for geoengineering?
I call it an aspiration, not an ambition, because I think that's what it is, right? So where we stand now, right, 2 degrees looks incredibly difficult, and 1.5 degrees looks more so. But, you know, equally, right, it was not to be expected at all that global emissions growth would be 0 in 2014, and it was. And that global emissions growth will probably be negative this year, 2015, and it probably will. Okay, so things could turn out better than we think now, even though it now looks very, very difficult to achieve.
Well, it's a stretch target for sure, and many climate scientists would say, why put a ridiculous temperature target in there that's unachievable? But other scientists say, well, it's technically achievable if you also have some negative emissions, and so that opens the door to one type of geoengineering, carbon sequestration. Whether it opens the door to solar radiation management, of course, is another question. But there are opportunities for negative emissions in terms of sinks, further sinks or so, carbon sequestration, and that's what a lot of scientists would say is necessary to get to 1.5.
And despite the sort of feasibility or not of the issue, the fifth assessment report suggests that, you know, a target of above 1.5 could have had serious implications for some small island states. So, you know, it was inevitable that, well, we were pushing for below 1.5, noting that we were addressing agreement in 2020 where things could change dramatically. But the reality is that we were not going to sign on to an agreement that set a 2 degrees temperature limit, because that eventually basically signed out the death knell for a number of countries. And it was one of the reasons why we didn't support Copenhagen. So it was not a viable option to just refer to 2 degrees.
I just want to add on the point about the Trojan horse. I think the discussion and in a way the battle about which way or how to achieve 1.5 degrees, so the pathways towards 1.5 degrees, I think a lot of the battle is going to take place in the IPCC report, in the preparation for that. And I'm sure there will be discussions about the options and the risks and the drawbacks and maybe the merits of geoengineering options. But I expect that to first play out in the scientific realm, but then spill over also towards the political realm. But I think the main points with 1.5 degrees, so I've read a lot of the stories about this is impossible, it's basically unrealistic to even commit yourself to that. But I think the main point behind it is like, well, it's an aspiration, we at least have to try to get there for the sake that Ian already mentioned. So I think it's very important that whatever discussion we have about feasibility and the options to achieve it, I think at least it's important to keep it as an aspiration.
Okay, I think we have a last question here.
Just following on from the 1.5 discussion, can you tell us more about why you think the market mechanisms are a bad idea? For myself, I wonder, how can you have a global cap and trade emissions market if it's irresponsible to allocate more emissions to that market if you need to hit 1.5?
I suppose my problem with the establishment of that market at this point in time is the sort of leakages that might occur, particularly at this point in time, the very low price of carbon. So, for example, with Australia, the expectation here is that we will be opening the doors to a very significant acquisition of credits international credits, and that will actually reduce the capacity to, or at least reduce the incentive to have domestic emissions reduction. Until you actually have a proper carbon market, a fully globalised carbon market and well-defined caps, I think that's always a problem. The second issue is that there is a great deal of faith being placed in the viability and also the resources of the markets that both exist and also the ones that are being established. There's a lot of hope that the Chinese national market, when it comes into being, is going to be an extremely tight market, but there are also good grounds, I think, to be a little concerned or a little anxious about how long that transparency and rigor might take to actually put in play in China. And we've seen some problems with verification of emissions there in recent times. So all of those things overall, I think, lead me to be a little concerned about the full reliance on the establishment of that sort of mechanism, given the time involved and given how little time we have to reduce emissions.
So finally, there's something we don't all agree on. Look, so you've got to think of a situation where all of these countries are actually serious about this, ratcheting up commitments, right? And that then implies rapidly rising carbon prices in all of these markets as well. And in that situation, carbon trading then makes sense also between, not just within nations, but also between nations, because you'll be in that situation where you have extremely low carbon budget, but where some countries will be engaged in emissions. It's still emissions-intensive production, such as what we still do in mining and agriculture, and we will be doing things in mining and agriculture. And there also will be some of the things that will remain to have greenhouse gas emissions attached to them, and that will need to be covered by stronger action elsewhere. So that's where I would see the role for carbon markets. What I certainly do agree on is that, you know, fulfilling, for example, a 2030 target by buying up remaining clean development mechanism credits at 50 euro cents a tonne is not a viable way of getting there, because where we do need to get to is a fundamental transition of how we do things.
See, we can have a little debate about this. Let's continue it for a moment. I think a great deal depends on how realistic and how sincere we are about the 1.5 ambition. If you have a close look at the science at the moment, there's a considerable discussion as to what the volume of carbon mass will be needed for us to have any hope of staying close to 1.5 might be. I think that despite the comment you quite rightly made about the global emissions at the moment doing some fairly surprising things, the emissions gap that is available to us to be covered for 1.5 is very slight indeed. Some science would say there's nothing there at all when you take into account global dimming and the consequences of that. So if one's going to be sincere about 1.5, one doesn't have a great deal of time for implementation of long-term mechanisms. It may work in a few places, but as a global carbon market, as the primary mechanism driving reductions, I don't think we have time to use that.
Fantastic. Thank you so much to everyone on the panel. If you're keen to discuss these things more and you're not too tired out from the conference and you don't need to go home and have a well-deserved nap, then there's another session being put on by the ANU Climate Change Institute, which is advertised in your program if you're interested in more. But can you all just please join me in thanking the panel for